Thank you, and good morning. It's good to see folks this morning. I know we'll probably name this in the prayer time again, but I'm very excited to see Angela with us up on the screen, up on our wall. Angela, we have been praying for you, and we are so excited that you're well and back. I also just want to, I can't help but call out Stephanie's Phillies jersey. So this is seasonally appropriate, just one win away from the World Series. Who would have guessed that? Our first reading this morning is a poem by Ariana Brown. It's called "For Everyone Who Tried on the Slipper Before Cinderella," which is kind of a playful way of naming what it is to live in waiting, and maybe in disappointments, and maybe in hope. For everyone who tried on the slipper before Cinderella. For those making tea in the soft light of Saturday morning, in the peaceful kitchen, in the cool house. For those with shrunken hearts still trying to love. For those with large hearts trying to forget. For those with terrors they cannot name, upset stomachs and too tight pants. For those who get cut off in traffic, for those who spend all day making an elaborate meal that turns out mediocre, for those who could not leave even when they knew they had to, for those who never win the lottery or become famous, for those getting groceries on Friday nights. There is something you know about living that you guard with your life, your one fragile, wonderful life. Wonder as in awe, as in, I had no idea I would be here now. For those who make plans and those who don't, for those driving across the country to a highway that knows them, for the routes we take in the dark, trusting, for the roads, for the woods, for the dead humming in prayer, for an old record and a strong sun, for teeth bared to the wind, a pulse in the chest, a body making love to itself. There is every reason to hate it here. There is a list of things making it bearable. Your friend's shoulder, Texas barbecue. Probably not your friend's shoulder, Texas barbecue. That's a little. Your friend's shoulder, Texas barbecue. A new book, a loud song, a strong song, a highway that knows you, sweet tea, an orange cat, a helping hand, an unforgettable dinner. A laugh that escapes you and deflates you like a pink balloon left soft with room for goodness to take hold. For those who have looked in the mirror and begged, for those with weak knees and an attitude, for those called sensitive or too much, for those not called enough, for the times you needed and went without, for the photo of you as a child, quietly icing cupcakes, your hair a crackling thunderstorm. Love is coming. It's on its way. Look. The assigned Bible reading for this morning is a bit different in tone. It comes from the book of Joel, which in the Hebrew Bible is grouped together in a section of prophetic writings referred to descriptively as the 12, because there are 12, it's a work of 12 different prophets. In Christian Bibles, they're grouped together at the end of what we call the Old Testament, and referred to as the minor prophets. Minor mostly because they're very short in comparison to the long works of those like Isaiah and Jeremiah. It's about 3 chapters long. The 3-chapter long book of Joel doesn't have any date. We don't know for certain when it was written. We don't really know anything about this writer Joel except for his father's name, Pethuel, which he says right at the beginning, introduces himself. This is the words of Joel, son of Pethuel. What we can see from his writing is that he shared the very common ancient tendency of seeing horrifying and terrifying events in the natural world as being punishments sent directly from God. And who am I kidding? That's not just an ancient tendency, is it? There are plenty of postmodern people with pre-modern worldviews. In Joel, the trauma and the tragedy that he writes about was a swarm of locusts, or it might have been multiple swarms of locusts that destroyed crops or multiple seasons of crops with the understandably devastating consequences. That still happens in the world, by the way. This past May, the eastern Cape of South Africa lost 19,000 acres of grazing land to the largest swarm of locusts they'd had in 25 years. The Italian Isle of Sardinia had its largest locust swarm in 30 years. So we can probably imagine people writing laments about that these days. We don't need to follow Joel's reasoning about this terrible natural act being a punishment in order to tap into the emotional and the spiritual reservoir of his work. He lived through desperate times, and he held out the possibility, even the conviction, that the world could be otherwise. And that's what we get this morning in this reading, a word of hope that comes after a word of judgment. We're also going to hear some verses that show up in the Christian writings of the New Testament that shaped how those writers thought about Judgment Day. They might sound familiar to you when I get there. Maybe the passage can help us reflect on judgment and hope alike. Rejoice, children of Zion. Rejoice. Be glad in Yahweh your God, who sends you rain, the autumn and the spring rains like of old, and a new spring crop. The threshing floors will be heaped with grain. The vats will overflow with new wine and oil. I will repay you for the years that were eaten away by the locust swarm. The winged locust, the scavenger locust, the bark-stripping locust, my great army that I sent against you. You will eat your fill and be satisfied and praise the name of Yahweh your God, who has dealt wondrously with you. My people will never again be put to shame. You will know that I am in the midst of the people, and that I, Yahweh, am your God, and that there is no other. My people will never again be put to shame. After that, I will pour out my spirit on all humankind. Your daughters and your sons will prophesy. Your elders will have prophetic dreams. Your young people will see visions. In those days, I will pour out my spirit even on those in servitude, women and men alike. I will show signs in the heavens and on earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon blood red at the coming of the great and terrible day of Yahweh. But everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh will be rescued, for there will be a remnant on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. This is Yahweh's promise. Anyone who invokes the name of God will be among that remnant. Words from Joel. Words of God. This past Tuesday morning, I stood in the courtyard of Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Society Hill, and I saw a vision of democracy. By Tuesday night, that vision was as vivid and electric as any biblical lucid dream about a heavenly city or of angels moving up and down on a stairway between heaven and earth. Let me back up a moment. This past week, Power Interfaith started a 3-week bus tour. Riders on the bus are various religious leaders going to different sites where other folks are gathering. They're calling the bus tour the Freedom Express. If you've been around long enough to hear us talk about power but aren't quite sure what that is, let me back up just a sec to say what it means. Power got its start in 2011. It's a multi-faith activist group. A group of religious congregations decided to work together to advocate for the common good, for a vision of justice, for solutions facing some of the city's problems. This congregation was among that first group that helped Power come together. The acronym POWER stood for, at that time, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. Their first campaign was to agitate to make sure that workers and and employees of subcontractors at the Philadelphia airport were receiving living wages. And they were successful in that campaign. They have also been successful in growing beyond the bounds of the city. Membership has grown out into the suburbs and into some other parts of the state. So now the P stands for Pennsylvanians, organized to witness, empower, and rebuild. And interfaith was added to the name to make clear that people are engaged in religiously based activism, faith-based activism across a spectrum of religious identities. So the Freedom Express spent this week in Philadelphia, where one of the primary aims was voter engagement. Next week, they'll be at a number of spots in western Pennsylvania. The week after, in some spots in central Pennsylvania. The focus of those stops will be different. In those parts of the state, the most visible forms of religion are primarily white and Christian. And what many of those Christians seem to think Jesus wants more than anything else is to force pregnant women to give birth, to keep immigrants out of the country, to deny that trans people exist, to keep kids from reading books with queer characters, to ignore the racism embedded in our history, and to make it harder for people of color to vote. White Jesus has a really strange agenda, I'll just say. Power aims to stand against that vision of religion and to show another way of being religious in public, a way that is broad, inclusive, and justice-oriented. It also aims to connect with people in those parts of the state who share the type of vision that they've got. But out front, Tuesday morning, out front of Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler reflected on what it meant to be standing on that spot in particular. Mother Bethel sits on what is the oldest piece of land in the country that has been continuously owned by black people. This in spite of the fact that there were some powerful actors who tried to force them to give it up in the early 1800s, during a time when the courts weren't known for upholding the rights of black folks. The founding pastor was the Bishop Richard Allen, who helped to start the AME denomination, who also ran a chimney sweeping business. I didn't know this. I learned this on Tuesday. He held the contract, the exclusive contract, to clean the chimneys in the presidential dwelling in Philadelphia for George Washington, where he would have shown up for the job, a free black businessman, and been led into the house and greeted by enslaved black people. Reverend Tyler named the long history of black people struggling for democracy, even when democracy was consistently letting them down and failing them. Another of the speakers out on that church property on Tuesday morning was a rabbi whose parents were each the only surviving member of their families to live through the Holocaust before they made their way to this country. And then there was a rabbinic student who described herself as a queer woman in an interfaith marriage. She's married to a UCC pastor, as it happens. She said that her family's long history here came about through the pure luck of her ancestors arriving before the country started some obscenely restrictive immigration laws in 1924. She also has family members who are connected to the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, so she feels very personally and deeply the scar of the mass shooting that happened there in 2018. Together, these speakers represented the vibrant promise of a pluralistic democracy that should have room for everyone to be connected and to thrive. And they also pointed to the threat that is posed by a nationalistic version of Christianity that mostly has room for people who are like me. In the afternoon, we were down the street that way, about 3.5 miles. In Germantown, on Maplewood Mall, Priscilla was there with us. We were there to register voters and to support a lineup of speakers who had either personally experienced loss from the city's gun violence or who were doing on-the-ground work to try and combat the city's epidemic of gun violence. It's important to know, one of the things that was raised up in that time, it's important for us to know that our state legislature has laws on the books that prevent Philadelphia from enacting their own gun legislation and regulations. It was Tuesday night, though, that was really a wonder to behold, and that offered a vision of what faith in public can look like. Power has never had any member congregations in South Philadelphia. It's been a blank spot as far as their organizing has been concerned. And that might be changing after our ridiculously large bus. They got an amazing bus. It's the picture on the bulletin cover and was on the opening slide. They got it professionally wrapped with a social media hashtag, all aboard with power, call it the Freedom Express, directs people to power, interfaith. It was a ridiculously large bus. We were passing SEPTA buses, and I was looking down on the people riding inside. So if you've spent any time in South Philadelphia, Eli, you can imagine that bus was carefully easing through streets that were not built for it. So, you could hear the trees scraping against it. I honestly think that our bus driver had some sort of magical powers. He did not touch a thing as we went through. Having been an 18-year-old who was allowed to drive a forklift through a Heckinger hardware store, I can't imagine how many things would have broken if I were driving that bus. But once that bus eased through those streets and found a place to let us off, we got off and headed into a small historic sanctuary where there was a gathering already in progress. We were there for a community listening session, which is an early stage in organizing that invites people to build relationships with each other and start giving voice to what their common concerns are. It started with a dinner that blended Central American and Asian Pacific flavors while we all mingled. We were crowded into the Episcopal Church of the Crucifixion on Bainbridge Street. It's a church that the eminent scholar W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about in 1899 in his book, The Philadelphia Negro. In the early 20th century, Marian Anderson sang there. It was a prominent African-American congregation, which had dwindled. The church closed in 2016, but it reopened a couple of years ago when their priest, Madre Jessie Alejandro, was ordained and installed there. And she is building a vibrant community with a congregation that's largely made of Latin American immigrants, and as far as I could tell, also involves other folks through a ministry of gathering food-based worship with foods from various cultures. After dinner, the program for the evening kicked off with a couple of English language songs sung by the praise band from an Indonesian evangelical congregation. Then Madre Jessie got up to give some comments in English that she translated into Spanish, or vice versa. It was going so quickly and so fluidly, she might have been giving them in Spanish and translating them into English. That's how well everyone there understood her, I think. And then after that, the pastor of that evangelical Indonesian congregation got up to speak, and he introduced his congregation's Guatemalan youth pastor. And then he told us, I think I'm remembering this correctly, that there are about 5,000 Indonesian immigrants in a fairly concentrated area of South Philadelphia, that they support 10 different congregations. 3 of those congregations, including his, were represented that night. And then he introduced the priest from the Indonesian Catholic congregation and the imam from the Indonesian Muslim mosque. Then we broke into small groups to talk with each other about, for people to talk with each other about their concerns for their communities. There was a range of things that came up. The one that was strongest in every single case was gun violence in the city. In my group, several Mexican women spoke to us with the aid of a translator, and they echoed those concerns. They also just beamed with pride about the fact that Madre Jessie had been able to gather such a large and diverse group of people into their congregation. At the end of all of this, all of us faith leaders in the room were called up to the front, standing on a stage, kind of like that, where we were asked to create a closing prayer for the whole thing, spontaneous creation of prayer, if you can imagine. We were each tasked with contributing a sentence. We were a group of religious leaders, so you know there were some run-on sentences going on. But by the time that microphone made its way around to each of us, we had filled that historic sanctuary with a prayer that came out in English, Spanish, Arabic, Hebrew, and Bahasa Indonesia that reflected the Spirit stirring through a variety of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian mouths. And then the praise band from Crucifixion sent us out into the night with the lively Latin rhythms of some energetic Spanish language songs. What a day. And what a night. And what a vision of how things can be. This is the country that I want to be a part of. Which requires something of us, doesn't it? And so a prophet speaks. A prophet speaks after a plague of locusts, after the devastation, or in the midst of the ongoing devastation. It speaks with a vision of hope that cuts through the prophet's dreams. We don't have to interpret the world or God's action in the world in quite the same way that the ancients did, as a fist smashing us when we do things wrong and then bringing us into something better. We can still hear the wise truth of their conviction that there is a path that leads to destruction and loss. There is also a path that leads toward wholeness and life. And every now and again, we get a glimpse of where that second one leads. It is a lure to us, a goad to lead us toward the life that keeps us open and in tune with the Spirit, that keeps us open and in relationship with our neighbors, and that keeps us grounded to the earth. And this is God's good news. Amen.